The honourable member for Scarborough Rouge River.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to add my strongest opposition and objection to this bill at hand, C-4, the, quote, Preventing Human Smugglers and Abusing Canada's Immigration System Act, end quote. I use quotations around this phrase not because it is the short title of this bill, but because this isn't really what the bill is about. It was presented by the Minister for Public Safety earlier as a bill that would protect Canadians and others from human smugglers. But in reality, it's a bill that attacks refugees and the Canadian immigration system. Mr. Speaker, let's be frank. This bill is not at all about human smuggling. Canada currently has the harshest punishment possible according to Canadian law if convicted of human smuggling. Under the Canadian law, smugglers are imprisoned for life. There's nothing stronger and no more severe form of punishment than life in prison in Canada. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about what this bill is really about. Playing politics with refugees and instilling a sense of fear in Canadians about refugees. We've seen this bill before, Mr. Speaker. This bill was and is remarkably similar to Bill C-49, presented in the last Parliament, and which was opposed by all members of the opposition parties and by so many Canadians across the board from coast to coast to coast. Let me speak to the false claims and the areas of ambiguity that this bill presents. Firstly, this bill positions refugees as queue jumpers. This is a falsehood. Refugees and asylum seekers must still follow the same processes and procedures of all claimants. It also creates a two-tier immigration system, creating two different levels of refugees, and a new classification of refugee, a new classification called a designated claimant. These are refugees who have irregular arrival. Of course, everything in quotations I'm borrowing from the bill. So that means anybody who shows up by boat. What this bill is essentially saying, Mr. Speaker, is that someone or a group of people who arrive in an irregular fashion, i.e. by boat, is not a refugee, but rather is a criminal. This bill is saying that people who wish to flee war or conflict zones or persecution, but do not have the means to buy, don't have the means to purchase an airplane ticket, are queue jumpers. So instead, because they can't buy a plane ticket, they risk their lives, throw themselves on a rickety cargo boat, spend 2 months coming across the ocean, any ocean. But nah, they're not real refugees. That's what this bill is telling us. They're not real asylum seekers. They're not really fleeing a horrible situation, leaving their families behind, leaving their livelihoods, leaving their homes, leaving a horrible situation. No, Mr. Speaker, this bill tells us that these people are liars, that they're not real asylum seekers. They're not here coming to Canada in hopes of a better life, risking their lives. But no, this bill tells us that they're criminals. This is what this bill and this government is telling us, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the history of this great country, it's very clear that Canada was built on the backs of immigrants. Historically, boatloads of immigrants have arrived at Canada's ports for centuries. Canada saw an immense amount of Irish refugees arriving during the famine at Canada's seaports. At that time, Canadians of the day were strongly in opposition of these refugees staying in Canada. Yet, they were permitted to stay, and today we see that they contribute so much, contribute positively to Canadian society. And now, we see people of Irish heritage all over Canada, including, Mr. Speaker, in this House, so many of today's members of Parliament have Irish descent. Mr. Speaker, refugees are people who contribute positively to the land in which they seek, the land that they go to. So how do we as a nation deal with boats that enter Canadian waters carrying refugees? Today, do we now turn them away, forcing them to return to their country of origin? Or rather, I must say, do we just now have other countries do our dirty work and intercept these boats in international waters so they don't make it here, so that we don't need to do anything like what we saw happen recently? Mr. Speaker, we have seen time and time again that the consequences of this type of action, this course of action, in 1914, with the Komogatu Maru carrying 376 passengers from Punjab, India, who were forced to return. In the 1930s, with the refugees on board the SS St. Louis, fleeing Nazi Germany, who were forced to return, who were killed when they got back by the hands of the Nazis, and so many others. Mr. Speaker, forcing these people to return to their country of origin is not the answer. While this bill specifically attacks refugees who arrive by boat, it will have detrimental effects on all claimants, regardless of whether they enter Canada by boat, by air, or by foot. This legislation would require the mandatory detention of all designate people arriving in Canada, whether they arrive by foot, by boat, or by air. This includes women, children, babies, the sick, the elderly. Anyone who arrives in Canada by any method would be required to be detained for a minimum of 12 months. That is an entire year, Mr. Speaker. After this 12 months is served, they might receive some consideration, but they can also be held for up to 5 years. They would also be denied permanent residence or family reunification for at least those 5 years after that. This is a clear violation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court of Canada has already struck down on mandatory detention without review in the past. This is detention based on identity, with no possibility of releases until the minister arbitrarily decides that identity is established. This breaches Sections 9 and 10 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Speaker, which protect people against arbitrary detention and the right to prompt review of that same detention. Arbitrary detention is also a violation of a number of international treaties that Canada is a signatory to. Why are we detaining these people to begin with, Mr. Speaker? When you think about it, people are usually detained because they are a danger to others or they're a flight risk and could disappear before their questioning or their trial happens. Should this bill pass, the government would have the right to jail or detain all refugees without proving that they are a danger to the society or that they're a flight risk for a minimum of 1 year without an appeals process. How is this just? Mr. Speaker, do you know the psychological effects detention and imprisonment has on children? Some British researchers have shown that even in just a few months of detention, the psychological effects on a child are tragic. They wet their beds, some become mute, others stop learning, they become withdrawn, they are not able to go to school because they can't focus, some lose weight, some don't eat. These psychological effects and physiological effects have been seen on children who have been jailed for just a few weeks or months. Think of the psychological scars that we will be inflicting on these children that are coming to our country, who are being placed in detention centers in Canada. Detention centers, otherwise also some may call them jails, but we'll call them detention centers. For at least a year we're putting these children. It is just totally unjustifiable. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, These people are being detained until they can prove their identity through some form of documentation. Most refugees who come to Canada do not have documentation, regardless of which process they use to enter the country. When people flee their nation, they leave behind everything. When they leave their country due to natural disaster, this documentation may not exist. How can we realistically expect people who are fleeing after they have lived through an earthquake or a tsunami to have appropriate documentation proving their identity? How can we expect people who have left a war-torn country to carry valid identification? A lot of refugees, Mr. Speaker, arrive at our shores without identification. These are people who could be classified as designated. Some of the refugee claimants and refugees who arrived here in Canada by the MV Sunsea now live in my constituency. I've spoken with many of them. They've told me their stories of their trip to Canada and their arrival in BC and how so many of them were on the borderline, holding on to their lives. We all know that one man perished on the journey across the ocean, across the Pacific. Many of them had United Nations identity cards. They had UNHCR refugee cards. Upon their arrival, the people who greeted them gathered all of their identity cards. And then when there weren't the same number of identity cards as individuals, they were told that they didn't have adequate identification on board. And regardless of whether or not they had had a refugee card, they were all detained. Thankfully, today, many of these people have been released because our great servicemen and women at Canada Border Service Agency took the time to sort out the identity cards. But still, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, many of them are still being detained today. Until, Mr. Speaker, under Bill C-4, decisions on claims by designated persons cannot be appealed to the Refugee Appeal Division. Eliminating the right to appeal can have tremendous consequences for these so-called designated persons. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that most of us have heard stories from our constituents about failed refugee applications. A person that has left their country only to face a heavily bureaucratic process and do not have enough or the right kind of supporting documentation to present at their hearing, and their application is unfortunately rejected. Sadly, some of us have heard horrific consequences of these failed refugees and what awaits their return when they are deported to their country of origin. Unfortunately, mistakes can happen, which is why we have the appeals process. This is why refugees deserve the ability to be able to appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division. My story, Mr. Speaker, my personal story, is like that of many Canadians, many immigrants to Canada. My father came to Canada from Sri Lanka, fleeing the Civil War during the early parts of the war, came to Canada as a refugee claimant. Once he was granted permanent residency, and then he sponsored my mother and my sisters to join us. We were reunited in Canada, and I'm proud to say that the child of a refugee claimant in Canada is now a member of Parliament. It's difficult for me to imagine, in the middle of this violent conflict, my father having the time to ensure that he had all of his documentations aligned, ready to go, everybody's identification ready to go, the supporting documents ready to go. When he's running away as he's being shot at or bombed at, how are we expecting people fleeing persecution, fleeing a war, to be able to have all of their identification in order? Fortunately, his application was approved and my family was able to join him here in Canada. This ability to collect all necessary documents, to have them available upon arrival, is absolutely unreasonable for so many. My father was lucky that he left at the early stages of the war. But the people who left later, people who are fleeing from all other countries in the world who are being bombed at, it's absolutely unfair. And this is why there are checks and balances in our refugee process, and that's why they're so integral. It is a part, and this is, absolutely goes against the compassionate nature that Canadians are known for, that Canada's values are. Canada's values lie in being compassionate and being concerned for human rights and being concerned for human beings. This is absolutely against that. When I first saw this bill, I asked myself, why would this government propose such a legislation? Why would they put forward a bill that attacked refugees? And Mr. Speaker, I'm taken aback. I'm taken back to the idea of queue jumpers. This government is trying to paint refugees as jumping the immigration queue. When you are fleeing persecution, fleeing a war or an area that's attacked by natural disaster, you cannot be called a queue jumper, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely cannot be called a queue jumper. With a large immigrant population in Scarborough Rouge River, I can easily say that the #1 form of casework in my constituency is immigration related. And of my immigration casework, there's an unbelievable amount of family reunification cases. People in my area are frustrated that they're waiting 5 to 10 to 15 years in the process. They're stuck in the process, waiting to have their families, their loved ones, join them here in Canada. When they begin the process of bringing their parent or sibling over to Canada, they're told that it would take 5 to 10 years. And they apply, and they wait, and wait, and wait, and just continue to wait. The backlog for parents who are waiting to come to Canada is in the hundreds of thousands. Why? It is because the number of visas for parents and grandparents issued this year has been reduced to close to 44% of what it was. It is getting longer and longer, the wait times are. This year, there are only 11,000 parents who can come to Canada. In 2005 and in 2006, the target was 20,000. Now, it's only 11,000, Mr. Speaker. This is a reduction of 9,000 people this current year. This is not the only backlog that exists, unfortunately. This Conservative government claims that it is clearing the backlog for skilled workers, when in actuality, the backlog for skilled workers grew. In 2005, there was a backlog of 487,000. Now, it is 508,000. In the past 6 years, this backlog has grown by 173,000 applications. This so-called clearing the backlog is unfortunately not working, Mr. Speaker. It is not working for skilled workers, and it's not working for families trying to reunify. Immigrants are getting resentful. They're resentful because they are waiting longer and longer to bring their loved ones to Canada. They're told by this government that there are people who are jumping the queue. There are hundreds of thousands of people waiting patiently, some not so patiently, to come to Canada. This is not due to nothing other than failed immigration policy, Mr. Speaker. People are really upset that they have to wait so long. Yet, rather than amending the immigration policy to actually deal with the backlogs and the time constraints, the Conservative governments are trying to find a scapegoat, these new refugees that are coming. This is not their fault or the fault of the failed immigration policies, but the refugees' fault. They're jumping the queue and taking the spots of all you other people who've been patiently waiting. What they fail to mention, Mr. Speaker, is that for refugees, there is no queue to jump. There is no lineup for people who are in a serious danger, for people who are living through a civil war, for people who are being persecuted because of their gender, their religion, their sexual orientation, etc., Mr. Speaker. When your life or the life of your family is called into question, there is no line. Once they are safely in Canada, they must then join the exact same queue as everyone else and wait their turn to get their status in our country. I'll stop with that for now, Mr. Speaker, because I know my time is up. Thank you very much.